Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Power Scaling 101. I'm your host Serpon, and today we'll be diving even deeper into the complexities of speed scaling. And if you haven't seen my video explaining all the speed tiers within power scaling, I implore you to at least go watch that first, as this video will make a lot more sense of what I'll be bringing up in this video. And with that all the way, let's get into it. First of all, what is speed? Going off the Google definition, it is the rate at which someone or something is able to move or operate. This definition works because it applies to both the physical movements of a character and as well as the processing of information within a character's mind, which kindly leads into the three main categories of speed, these being travel speed, combat speed, and reaction speed. Besides the fact that these categories of speed are pretty self-explanatory, let's further elaborate each one and establish the differences as we go along. Starting off with travel speed, which mainly refers to a character or object's raw movement when traveling, either by running or by other means that doesn't involve flight or teleportation. Why is this? To further elaborate, teleportation is the ability to move instantaneously from one location to another without occupying the physical space in between. So by definition, it's not only an ability that doesn't apply to your sheer movement speed, but it's explicitly an ability that's sole purpose is to make traveling via sheer movement unnecessary. And as for flight, it's most often cited as its own separate category of speed, due to also being described as an ability a character can have. But unlike teleportation, it does involve occupying a physical space when traveling to and from certain locations. So although technically flight speed and travel speed aren't the same solely based on their different means of traveling between locations, however, it is possible for them to be either equal, relative, or not equal at all. Now, hold on, I know you might be confused and wonder why that's the case, but it's really important that I first explain combat speed and reaction speed before I further elaborate. So how do you define combat speed and reaction speed? To put it simply, without being literal, combat speed specifically refers to the speed that your limbs, such as your arms and legs, move during combat, and reaction speed specifically refers to the speed at which you're able to both mentally process and receive information as you perceive something. Now, in order to properly understand the difference between these two categories of speed, we must first fully elaborate on what reaction speed entails, not only in the reference to power scaling a fictional character, but also in real life, which mainly boils down to this: reaction time plus movement time equals response time. Reaction time being the time of stimulus, the thing or event that evokes the specific reaction, to the beginning of movement, and movement time being the beginning to the end of said movement, which in all equals to what is known as response time. Are you still with me? Good, because now it's time to explain the two different types of response time, those two being simple response time and choice response time. Simple response time refers to single stimulus and single response. For example, if you're about to start a race for a 100-meter dash, and you're awaiting the gun to fire to officially start the race and set you off, or when the gun goes off and you just begin to push off the blocks, it's your as the gun going off would be the single stimulus in which once heard, then leads to the quick single process and receive response to then start applying pressure to the blocks as you're just beginning to blast off them. And then movement time is when you're just beginning to blast off the blocks to you then leaving the blocks. In all, that's an example of simple response time. Choice response time, however, refers to multiple stimuli and decisions needed. For example, say I throw a cupcake at you while I'm standing in front of you. The reaction time now involves multiple stimuli, which not only involves you perceiving the cupcake and or object, but also that it's being thrown and it's coming at you. And unlike simple response time, you have to make a decision of what to do as you're now fully aware that a cupcake is being thrown at you. As you can either stand there and take it, try and grab it as it's coming at you, or move out of the way so you don't get hit. And once you make your decision, let's say you decide to dodge it, is when your movement time comes into play. Obviously, this would indicate that simple response time is inherently much quicker than choice response time, as it involves having to react to a single stimulus to make a single response, in contrast to having to react to multiple stimuli and make a decision in response to all of them. So now that we fully define reaction speed, how does it relate to and differentiate from combat speed? Well, usually, you would most often assume first that a character's combat speed or reaction speed would at the very least be relative to each other. Because let's say if you're able to combat someone who's faster than light, then that would entail that your reactions would have to be faster than light. If you weren't able to react at that same speed, you wouldn't be able to combat it. However, it is possible for your reaction speed to be faster than your combat speed. All this was best explained in the scene from part 1 of Naruto, when Rock Lee and Sasuke fight for the first time. During this fight, Rock Lee was demonstrated to, even when holding back, to not only be much stronger than Sasuke, but also be much faster than him as well. Lee then explains that despite having the Sharingan, which amplifies his mental reaction and perception, he wouldn't be able to move his body quick enough to block his attacks, despite having the mental capabilities to see them coming.
I do not try to hide or disguise my moves. I do not have to. Even if you can read them, you still cannot stop them. You are too slow. Your eyes may be quick enough to stay one step ahead of me, but if your body cannot keep up, what good does it do you?
Another way to explain the difference between combat and reaction, and how your reaction can be faster than your combat, is by bringing up the concept of aim dodging. Aim dodging refers to the technique of avoiding linear attacks by repositioning oneself away from the path of an attack before it is fired. For example, if I sidestepped out of the way of an oncoming speeding car, am I now as fast as the car? Obviously not, because I was not only able to anticipate and see the car coming at me, but it was coming at me in a linear or straight path, which makes it easier to react to when its movements are that easy to predict. This most often explains why some characters are capable of dodging lasers that are traveling in a straight line or in a linear path and still be considered to not have faster than light combat speed. Because although lasers are most often light-based attacks, meaning they should be traveling at light speeds, however, if they travel in a linear path and or the character is able to anticipate the attack coming, that only means they have faster than light reaction times and it doesn't apply to their combat speed. So now that we've covered the definitions for the three main types of speed, it's time we go over how we often determine whether the types of speeds, when applied to a certain character, are either relative, equal, or not equal at all, in which involves the uses of a scientific and philosophical rule that's known as Occam's razor. In simple terms, Occam's razor dictates that when presented with two competing theories, whichever is the simplest solution is most often the best solution. In other words, a theory that requires the least amount of assumptions, a thing that is accepted to be true without evidence to be made, is more likely to be true than a theory that requires a greater amount of assumptions. For example, say a tree fell down and two people came across that tree. One says that it most likely got knocked down by wind, and the other says it got knocked down by two meteors, one knocking the tree down, and the other to destroy the evidence of a meteor being there. Now, just based on this alone, which theory seems the most probable out of the two? Most of you would have probably chosen the first option, which is only natural, as often when faced with two opposing explanations for the same amount of evidence, our minds will naturally prefer the explanation that makes the fewest assumptions. Not to say that this automatically makes the one theory correct, but it's certainly more likely to be than the other. This especially helps us when comparing two different interpretations of someone else's work. If one requires less assumptions and creates less contradictions than the other, then that interpretation would be considered more valid than the other. So what does all this have to do with the topic at hand? Simple. Unless proven otherwise, it would be safest to assume that a character's reaction, combat, and travel speed are at the very least relative or approximately equal. Relative meaning considered in relation or in proportion to something else, and approximately equal means very similar to not exactly equal due to rounding or other reasons. In other words, you'd assume they'd all be close enough to each other while not being equal, but at the same time not so different to where a distinction is required to be made. For example, if we take post-crisis Superman, we'd at first assume that his flight speed and travel speed would be very similar to each other. But if we look at this scan called The Great Race, it shows a description that states that this is where Superman would be if he was running, but if he was flying, he would be the fastest on the list. So since we now have some evidence to prove there is a blatant distinction, it is now safe to assume that Superman's flight speed is faster than his travel speed. However, it works differently when it comes to attack speed, otherwise being the speed of a particular attack, like an energy blast. For example, if a character has only demonstrated feats of him moving at hypersonic speeds, but he can create beams of natural light, then obviously this indicates that although the speed of an attack is light speed, it would require a greater amount of assumptions to say the character automatically scales to it. Therefore, unless proven otherwise, the speed of a user's attack doesn't scale back to the user. But let's get into the common misconception that's still being thrown around in relation to combat and travel speed. That unless proven otherwise, your travel speed would never scale to or even be relative to your combat speed. So what's exactly wrong with this? Well, besides the opposite being true, there is a lot wrong with this, so let's get into it. Essentially, saying that you would at first assume that your travel and combat speed don't scale to each other at all is like saying it's impossible to punch while running at the same time, which I'm fairly certain applies to most humans in real life, so it'd be pretty dumb to make this your baseline assumption. But what if I'm going at my top speed, you might ask? Well, let's talk about sprinters in real life and hurdles. These people are obviously going at their top speeds, but are still able to jump hurdles, as them sprinting the distance relates to their travel speed, and them being able to move their legs over the hurdles relates to their combat speed. If these two didn't scale to each other, they would simply crash into the hurdles. And if your combat and travel speed didn't scale to each other along with your reaction speed, then you would always be crashing into walls whenever you're going at your top speed. This is often seen in fiction when characters receive a particular amp or power up, and because they aren't used to combating at that level, they often get overwhelmed and lose control. For example, when Goku first got Super Saiyan God, and when Naruto first got his KCM cloak, when they both charged at their opponent, Goku got overwhelmed by the speed and almost couldn't stop himself, and Naruto literally crashed into a wall, with both commenting on how surprised they were at that massive increase they got. This argument that you shouldn't assume first that a character's travel and combat speed don't scale to each other relates to how some people, including certain content creators, treat immeasurable speed. That supposedly unless a character has been shown to be able to fight while traveling through time, you can't say the character has immeasurable combat speed, in which I already debunked in my previous argument. So in summary, you would always assume at first that a character's travel, combat, reaction, and flight speed would likely scale each other unless proven otherwise, with attack speed being the only major exception, but not always. Well, anyway, that's it for the video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you want to see more content like this, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and set your notification bell to all so you'll immediately be notified whenever a new video comes out. Comment down below on any video topics you want to see me cover next. But until then, thank you all for watching, and class is dismissed.